That triumph they celebrated, it means nothing now. Are you prepared to uncover the hidden truth behind the crusade that nearly collapsed under empty stomachs and shredded banners hanging above an ancient fortress? I'm about to expose the most jealously protected secret of how the Crusaders survived when they chose to defend Antioch, even as their energy drained away and optimism evaporated into the Syrian dust. This isn't merely a tale of attacks and conflicts, but a chronicle of determination, organization, and strategic thinking by leaders who clashed more intensely with each other than with their opponents. Here, partnership and competition, spiritual passion and ruthless strategy, calculated diplomacy and sudden strikes wove together. Everything mattered. From winter storms to supply caravans hauling grain and timber, from native scouts to Constantinople's commitments. Stay until the final moment, and you'll discover how the surrounded forces unearthed a relic from the earth that transformed hopelessness into a march toward the holy city. What if everything you've learned about warfare is completely obsolete, and the genuine conflict starts not at the fortifications but long before them, where each day of marching holds more value than bloodshed? I reached this understanding while examining the Crusade's path through Asia Minor, where after triumphs at Nicaea and Dorylaeum, common folk and warriors transformed into depleted wanderers. Those initial victories dissolved in the road dust, and certainty shifted to unease. The routes extended between ridges and plateaus, where sunlight baked the ground to pale rock. Where shade existed yesterday, today brought heat that made horses' flesh split like aged leather. Water ran scarce, every container was monitored, and each drink sparked arguments. The crusading forces advancing in separate columns, Normans, Provençals, Flemish, Germanic peoples, Italians, looked like a fragmented river rather than a single military unit. Every commander selected his own direction, believing it the sole correct choice. But the pathways intersected, the wagons became separated, and the structure dissolved, becoming a line of individuals slowly pulling themselves across the scorched terrain. The opponent was omnipresent, though unseen. Turkish forces avoided head-on battles, but operated with precise effectiveness. They set fire to vegetation, contaminated water sources, and scattered livestock. Where a herder stood yesterday, only ash remained by sunrise. During daylight, the atmosphere hummed with temperature and insects. At nightfall, the crying of wild dogs and soft groans of the weakened echoed. Individuals lost not just their energy, but also their trust in divine intervention, in solidarity, in the campaign's purpose itself. The expedition, envisioned as a holy mission, became a sequence of ordeals. With every sunrise, the force diminished. Countless horses perished, weaponry corroded from perspiration, and protective gear became useless weight. Common people and artisans who had enlisted marched without footwear, binding their feet in cloth strips. Even the warriors, distinguished and battle-tested, started recognizing that courage couldn't substitute nourishment. Yet during this punishing trek, a different strength emerged, not from aristocratic arrogance, but from resilience. In dusty encampments where the final bread morsel was divided, and in wayside chapels where individuals prayed without clergy, another force was taking shape, silent, steadfast, connected not by fame, but by shared necessity. By autumn of 1097, this desperate alliance had assembled at Antioch's perimeter. It was fragmenting from starvation, jealousy, exhaustion, but it persisted. Every leader searched for justification for the expedition in the coming assault. Bohemond pursued structure and precision. Raymond of Toulouse pursued conviction and miracles. And Godfrey and Robert of Normandy pursued recognition that would eclipse their hardships. While they debated, those who simply desired to witness the journey's conclusion were perishing beneath their standards. And still this agonizing march provided new significance to the conflict. Here for the initial time they grasped that triumph isn't forged in combat. It's nurtured throughout the journey. Meticulous logistics, detailed record-keeping, the capacity to continue forward when the flesh pleads to collapse. These became the invisible weapons. Therefore, the expedition that commenced with sermons and melodies became a training ground for survival. It generated not pilgrims, but individuals who had mastered endurance, patience, and combat without fantasies. And now the question for you: what matters more in warfare? One spectacular engagement that historians will document, or months of mundane logistics that nourish victory from within? Express your perspective in the comments, and remember to subscribe. Next, you'll discover how the path of optimism became a trial of faith and spirit, where every footstep became a plea for survival. Are you prepared to understand the reality of why the massive city gleaming on the hillsides above the Orontes didn't surrender in a week or a month? Even when the glow of the flames wavered in the breeze and the prayers in the encampment were shortened to a handful of words, Antioch stood like a stone creature, encircled on every side, but undefeated. Its fortifications extended for numerous kilometers, creating a jagged perimeter with hundreds of towers, each capable of serving as an independent stronghold. The Crusader forces lacked the capacity to seal all the routes, footpaths, crossings, gorges where openings were concealed. Yagi Sion's defenders exploited this. Like a tracker understands trails, raids came one after another. Mounted units struck the provision wagons, and from the east, from Aleppo and Damascus, supply trains arrived under darkness with wheat, projectiles, fabric, and reinforcements. Every day the fortress endured was a setback for the besiegers. The natural world became partners with the citadel. Winter arrived with crushing force. The downpours continued for weeks, converting the valley into marshland where mounts sank to their chests and wagons submerged with their loads. The waterway burst its boundaries, crossings were swept away, and flames were smothered by the gale. The encampments arranged in a circle around the fortress descended into the mire. Footwear adhered, mantles became coated with fungus, and even the leaders' shelters reeked of moisture and combustion. Timber became as precious as treasure, and loaves as precious as a vow. The freezing was no less merciless than the adversary. Individuals rested huddled against their defenses, dried their garments over embers, and distributed their final measure of wine mixed with heated water. On evenings like these, every blaze was a refuge. Illness propagated through the formations faster than gossip, and frailty converted warriors into ghosts of their past selves. Efforts to assault the fortifications without equipment concluded in catastrophe. Forces without scaling devices with cords and grappling tools hurled themselves at the ramparts. But the defenders greeted them with flames, boulders, and scalding liquid. No quantity of valor could substitute engineering. Then, the leaders altered their strategy. They resolved not to demolish the barriers, but to constrict the encirclement. They constructed timber platforms, ditches, and barriers on the elevations, obstructing the routes. Small teams of warriors were dispatched on ambushes, capturing couriers and supply trains. Occasionally fortune favored them, and a caravan fell into their possession. But occasionally everything disintegrated, and the adversary, understanding the landscape, vanished into the mist, leaving behind incinerated transports. Between accomplishments and setbacks, an interminable winter extended. Pressure vibrated in the encampment. Warriors complained and leaders disputed. Bohemond envisioned recognition as a leader, Raymond of righteousness and structure. Godfrey pursued devotion in conflict. Robert of Normandy pursued treasure and acknowledgement. Their shelters stood adjacent, but their dialogues increasingly became disputes about the future, dignity, and the entitlement to the fortress. Behind the surface courtesy existed a conflict, silent but relentless. Meanwhile, the defenders did not yield. Projectiles soared from the platforms, percussion instruments resonated on the ramparts, and alert blazes illuminated at nightfall. The fortress existed, respired, and answered to the challenge. For the Crusaders, it was degrading to stand at the fortifications where the adversary continued to celebrate and perform. But it was during these weeks of hopelessness that something started to develop that would alter everything. In the obscurity between alerts and sentries, invisible activity commenced. Phrases instead of blades, murmurs instead of assault equipment. One individual on the platform, exhausted and neglected, became the connection between two realms. His choice became the invisible pivot, after which even stone couldn't withstand. Therefore concluded the initial phase of the blockade, not with an attack, not with triumph, but with an anticipation of transformation. And now the inquiry is, who was the genuine victor of this phase? The one who maintained the fortifications, or the one who comprehended that fortresses are captured not with lances but with human phrases articulated at the correct moment? The whispers are accurate. We're isolated. I'm about to expose the most jealously protected secret. Occasionally, fortresses equivalent to entire realms collapse not from demolition equipment and scaling devices, but from a solitary murmur, a solitary observation, a solitary concealed motion that alters everything. At the conclusion of May 1098, the blockade of Antioch was approaching its culmination. Filth, illness, starvation, and hopelessness had converted the encampment into a ghost of a military force. Individuals were perishing by the blazes. Clergy were praying in whispers, and warriors were disputing about who would obtain the recognition if they survived like this. And then, when conviction was depleting, an opportunity materialized unlike any engagement. Bohemond, prudent and frigid in his assessments, obtained intelligence from his informants. There was an individual within the fortress barriers, a sentinel named Firuz. He had previously been an artisan, conducting business in metal and textiles, but destiny had guided him to serve Yagi Sion. He understood the fortifications like a woodworker understands the pattern of timber. He understood when the sentries rotated, where the flames were positioned, and most significantly, he understood the worth of quietness. Initially, it appeared like speculation, but confirmation demonstrated that Firuz was genuine and he had a motive to deceive. Exhaustion, starvation, bitterness toward his merciless superior. The discussions continued for weeks through envoys under concealment of nightfall in the downpour amid the howling of canines and the rustling of vegetation near the Orontes. Phrases were murmured, sentences retained because not a fragment of parchment could be abandoned. Bohemond evaluated the hazard. If it was an ambush, all would be forfeited. If it was genuine, the fortress would collapse without a demolition device. On the designated evening, everything was resolved. Obscurity descended like a dense covering, and a unit of several dozen individuals removed their protection and enclosed their blades in cloth so that the metal wouldn't resonate. They advanced along the ravine where the water concealed their footfalls. Every footstep was worth their existences. Finally, a silhouette flashed at the base of the platform. Firuz, in a mantle without protection, stood at the entrance. One hand elevated, a indication. There was a silent creak of mechanisms, and the entrance pivoted open just adequately for an individual to traverse. The warriors entered almost silently. First 2, then 5, then dozens. Cords, brief scaling devices, murmured directives. The initial confrontation occurred in the obscurity. 3 sentries collapsed without an opportunity to vocalize. A flame illuminated on the barrier, an indication that the passage was accessible. A current of individuals flooded inside. The fortress awakened in panic. Chimes resonated, percussion instruments summoned to weaponry, but structure was disintegrating. The defenders did not comprehend where the adversary was, inside or outside. The engagement in the constricted passages continued until sunrise. Vocalizations, the resonance of metal, blazes, silhouettes sprinting with flames. Yagi Xian attempted to arrange a resistance in the stronghold, but the strike was too rapid. By sunrise, he was discovered deceased. And Antioch, the fortress of narratives, was in the possession of those who could scarcely stand. But with triumph came a different quietness. Not celebration, but exhaustion. The Crusader forces stood in the midst of the conquered fortress, where there was no nourishment remaining, where the reservoirs were vacant, and the atmosphere was dense with combustion. They had captured the fortifications, but they had not discovered deliverance. Individuals rested directly on the boulders, grasping their weaponry as if apprehensive of awakening and imprisonment. And just then, while the blazes were still smoldering, different dust formations materialized on the boundary. These were Kerboga's forces from Mosul, Aleppo, and Haran. Fresh, nourished, arranged, they brought retribution for a fortress that had collapsed not at the fortifications but from within. Therefore commenced the subsequent phase of the blockade. Triumph became a snare, Firuz vanished, his identity became a narrative, and the warriors who had penetrated the fortifications recognized that the genuine attack was still to arrive. Like this: if you trust that in the chronicle of conflict the most powerful demolition device is not timber or flames, but human assessment, resilience, and the capacity to anticipate the instant when the entrance opens for just one respiration, and the entire realm alters. Anticipate what occurred next? Those who yesterday were performing hymns and expressing gratitude to the divine for the triumph discovered themselves today imprisoned in a stone enclosure. The fortifications that were intended to safeguard them became a confinement, and the passages recently occupied with flames and recognition became constricted routes of apprehension. The besiegers became the besieged, and it was not the adversary, but exhaustion, starvation, and uncertainty that commenced to erode at the military force from within. The triumph over the fortress proved to be merely a prelude to a different blockade, quieter, but far more dreadful. When Kerboga's military force, regimented, fresh, and considerable, approached Antioch, the terrain beneath their hooves smoked with particles. The advanced sentries sealed the encirclement like a constricting cord. All the routes that yesterday had been traversed by supply trains hauling grain, sodium, and wine were now severed. Quietness suspended over the valley, not an uneasy quietness, but a fatal one. The supply trains had vanished. The couriers did not reappear, and the boundaries were forfeited in the obscurity. It appeared that the very atmosphere had become a captive along with the individuals. Initially, everyone trusted that this was provisional, that assistance would arrive from the north, from Byzantium, from the Holy Territory, from partners, that they could endure for a week, 2 weeks, a month. But each nightfall brought more apprehension, and each sunrise verification of provisions became an act of hopelessness. Warriors tallied containers of wheat, separated the remaining wine into droplets, and grain into particles. Servants heated vegetation, dried hide from straps and horse fittings just to deceive their stomachs with something. Nourishment became a measurement of duration. What they consumed today determined how long they would exist tomorrow. Starvation made everyone equivalent. There were no longer aristocrats and commoners, only the existing and the frail. Lords and attendants contested over a fragment of loaf. Warriors and chaplains went together to retrieve water, distributing the final container. Townspeople who concealed reserves of wheat became adversaries within the barriers. They interred their reserves under the surfaces, secured their storehouses with restraints, and at nightfall, individuals crept to other individuals' blazes to pilfer at least a measure of porridge. And all this occurred under the observation of the stronghold, where the remnants of the Turkish defenders still maintained. Projectiles soared from the platforms. Alert blazes illuminated in the obscurity, and it appeared that the fortress itself was exacting retribution on those who had arrived to subjugate it. Any blaze became turmoil. Warriors rushed to extinguish it, not understanding whether it was a storehouse burning or the final reserves. Every motion of a silhouette caused alert. Every speculation caused panic. Individuals awakened not to the resonance of a trumpet, but to the spasms of a vacant stomach. Mounts collapsed directly in the passages, and their pelts were dried and consumed. Defenses served as coverings for earthen excavations where minute blazes were ignited. Turmoil reigned at command. Some suggested a raid, to strike initially before it was too delayed. Others discussed diplomacy, requesting clemency, vowing retreat. But everyone was forfeiting energy. Even prayers resonated vacant, as if the divine was exhausted of perceiving the identical thing over and over. Conviction, once burning brilliantly in every encampment, now scarcely smoldered like embers in a moist hearth. Outside, the adversary operated tranquilly, methodically, assuredly. Kerboga comprehended that a blade was unnecessary when duration was on your side. His warriors constructed defensive positions, excavated trenches, obstructed streams, and extracted water from the terrain itself. Every day the blockade encirclement expanded tighter, and Antioch expanded closer to destruction. There was less water than optimism, and both were depleting simultaneously. And still, in this obscurity, amid the filth and starvation, something commenced to materialize that couldn't be measured by wheat or treasure. Individuals commenced to adhere together. Where there had been conflict and jealousy, there was now regimentation. Where there had been grievances, there were now prayers. Leaders mastered to discuss not about recognition, but about structure. They comprehended that triumph now was not a penetration, but resilience, not a blade, but quietness. And then, something occurred that altered everything. Among the ruins and wreckage, they discovered a relic, an artifact that became not just a representation, but an anchor for the military force's awareness. It provided individuals the sensation that the divine had not abandoned them. The relic became the nucleus of a different conviction, a different regimentation, and a different respiration of existence. Individuals commenced to elevate at the indication again, to distribute nourishment equitably, to stand sentinel at nightfall without grievance. In the subsequent chapter, you'll discover what this relic was, why it became a source of support rather than a weapon, and how psychological resilience proved to be more valuable than an entire storehouse of wheat. Because occasionally it is conviction, not nourishment, that sustains a military force that has nothing remaining to consume. What you have never witnessed is how a representation becomes a timetable and conviction becomes a management instrument, not in sermons, but in the mire of encampments. Everyone understood it was equitable. Progressively, the encampment revived. Where yesterday there had been a sluggish quietness, now the metalworks resonated again. Mallets pounded in the facilities in the courtyards. Woodworkers hammered on defenses. Projectile shooters dried their cord by the blaze. Near the entrance, posts were driven into the terrain in direct lines measured according to the designs. Even the breeze resonated different in these formations, like the respiration of structure. Individuals who had recently been staggering from starvation no longer sensed like a multitude, but like a military force. And regimentation maintains the blaze burning. It preserves where prayers fail, because structure is a form of optimism converted into activity. Are you prepared for the astonishing reality? Occasionally, the sole path to deliverance is not away from the adversary, but directly through their shelters, where every error reeks of mortality and every footstep is a trial of conviction. There were now orderly tables with durations and representations like in a monastery chronicle. The frail, the ill, and the wounded were positioned in the nucleus, not out of compassion, but out of assessment. There, under sealed defenses, they were safeguarded by the physiques of those who could still combat. Experienced warriors, Normans, Provenals, and Lorrainers were positioned on the peripheries. They had the most difficult task, the initial strikes and resistance against encirclement. Each standard carrier was provided a reference location, and that was adequate. Particles elevated like combustion from an invisible blaze, but no one halted. Each footstep was not a motion of the physique, but an exertion of the essence. By midday, the structure had sealed into a semicircle. Kerboga's adversary informants couldn't trust their observation. From a fortress doomed to mortality, a military force had materialized, collected and silent. Not a multitude, not fugitives, a structure advancing forward. The initial strikes were like flashes of illumination. The Emirates' formations faltered, indications were confused, and couriers couldn't deliver directives in duration. Kerboga witnessed from afar how his encirclement was fracturing, but couldn't comprehend where the nucleus of the strike was. Lances bent, standards vanished in the particles, and vocalizations merged into a roar. The Crusaders advanced as if they themselves had neglected that they were starving. Their visages were coated with ash and perspiration, but their observation was clear. Like those who had already overcome apprehension, they transported not weaponry, but structure made flesh. Their formations constricted like a coil, and each different strike made them more powerful. The Kerboga alliance fractured where forces from different territories converged. Syrians, Moslewites, and Bedouins disputed over who should maintain the formation and who should retreat. The commanders vocalized, but no one listened. The military force, which had recently appeared invincible, was suffocating under its own weight. By evening, the terrain was no longer terrain, but a whirlwind. The solar body set in combustion, and it appeared as if the ground itself was burning. But the Crusader forces continued to advance without fanfare, without celebration, just forward. Their structure, forged in starvation and agony, proved more powerful than shelters made of fabric. In the subsequent chapter, you'll discover why Kerboga's alliance disintegrated faster than metal under a strike, and how a military force that had been deprived of loaf yesterday managed to defeat an adversary more than twice its magnitude. What do you think destroys alliances faster? The blade, arrogance, or duration, when the conviction of one is more powerful than the apprehension of 1,000. Under pressure from the raid, the adversary's outer structure faltered, but not instantly. Kerboga's formations didn't disintegrate in an instant. They diverged like fabric where the connections commenced to extend and burst, leaving illumination between the strands. Initially, these were scarcely noticeable gaps through which combustion from the blazes seeped. Then, voids between the shelters, routes leading to the plateaus. It was there, into these shifting gaps, that the forces guided out of the lateral entrances rushed initially. They advanced silently without vocalization, without fanfare, not to conclude the adversary, but to create routes. Their task was not to terminate, but to clear the territory, to convert the fracture into a passage, a corridor through which the main force could flow. It was an instant when the very logic of the engagement commenced to alter. The Crusader forces, who just yesterday had been imprisoned between the fortifications and the plateau, were now advancing outward like water, discovering an outlet. They didn't advance in structure. They flowed, bypassed, distributed across the vacant territories. And everyone understood that behind this improvised structure existed a carefully constructed strategy. In Kerboga's encampment, they still trusted they were imposing blockade on the fortress. But the blockade had already converted against them. The key pivot arrived when some of Kerboga's partners, forces from Damascus and Aleppo, refused to obey directives. They sensed that the engagement was forfeited, and without anticipating the indication, they abandoned their locations, transporting their standards toward the plateaus. The panic was not instantaneous, but it propagated like wildfire. The leaders attempted to halt the retreat, but their directives didn't reach their personnel. The couriers were forfeited in the particles, and the indications were invisible in the combustion. The formation, which had been dense and solid as a barrier just an instant before, commenced to fracture into fragments. In these gaps, like fractures in frozen water, the entire engagement commenced to disintegrate. The warriors comprehended the instant without phrases. They struck not for recognition or for the vocalization of triumph. Their footsteps were precise, their motions restrained, their strikes brief. Each understood whom he was covering and to whom he was transferring the location. The corridors they carved out became the existing arteries of the military force. The infantry advanced through them, slowly but steadily. No one rushed for treasure. Cauldrons, standards, and containers of wheat existed underfoot, but structure was paramount. Even the wounded were not abandoned, but dragged aside without interrupting the motion. In the nucleus of the front, they maintained pace as if advancing to an invisible rhythm. Turkish leaders attempted to assemble their scattered formations, but their indications were forfeited in the roar and particles. The Crusader infantry advanced like a wave, coordinated with natural fluidity. Lances were stuck into the terrain at the identical angle. Defenses were sealed and footsteps were synchronized. The peripheries covered each other like mechanisms, permitting different formations through so that no section was left exposed. By midday, the corridors, which had been unstable and dangerous in the morning, had converted into routes. Transports, standards, and exhausted but existing individuals extended along them. Particles settled on their visages, but their observation shone, not with excitement but with assurance. When the combatants finally observed back, the fortifications of Antioch no longer appeared like a confinement. They witnessed them for the initial time as a rear, as safeguarding, as an indication that everything was not in vain. It was a triumph not of energy but of consistency, a triumph of rhythm, where every second, every footstep, every respiration obeyed structure. There was no location here for the madness of impulse, only frigid resilience and the memory of starving days when those who understood how to tally and anticipate survived. The engagement terrain became a mechanism where each individual was a component, and this mechanism, creaking but not fracturing, penetrated through the encirclement that maintained the fortress. Therefore, concluded the engagement where it was not inspiration but iron repetition that resolved the outcome. Structure became not just a weapon, it became the strategy itself. On that day, individuals comprehended that regimentation is not a restraint, but a force that permits you to advance forward when all else is forfeited. After the blockade was elevated, the most difficult inquiry existed on the table like a map without defined boundaries. Who did Antioch belong to? The victors sat in the identical shelter but articulated different languages of claim. Some reminded them that it was their scaling devices that initially contacted the stone, while others referred to the vows made at the entrances of Constantinople, where the emperor had vowed acknowledgement and assistance. Still others disputed that entitlements were born not from vows, but from the blood shed beneath the fortifications and the wheat expended on the blockade. The fortress stood not only as a trophy, but as a crossroads. Its markets, storehouses, and entrances guided south where the route to Jerusalem existed. Capturing Antioch signified not only subjugating it, but also maintaining it. Defenders, provisions, and structure were needed. This was the snare. Possession required not dignity, but responsibility. Discussions commenced. Sitting at the tables were not partners, but neighbors united only by their recent engagement. Each considered only his own version to be equitable. Bohemond referred to military accomplishment and personal hazard. Raymond of Toulouse articulated a vows and obligation to the emperor. Robert of Flanders pursued a compromise, but his phrases were drowned out by general exhaustion and mistrust. As long as the standards remained above the fortifications, the dispute dragged on. Every day of delay cost nourishment, attention, and energy, and the route to Jerusalem converted into a mirage beyond the boundary. The military force, recently united by a common threat, was now disintegrating at the connections over inquiries of ownership. And still, this dispute became a lesson. Here beneath the platforms of Antioch, the warriors comprehended for the initial time that the capacity to distribute authority and maintain solidarity was no less significant than the capacity to maintain structure in particles and combustion. Triumph over the adversary didn't signify peace among themselves. Therefore, concluded the initial cycle. The conflict, not only for fortifications, but also for significance. Antioch remained not just a fortress, but a mirror in which each leader witnessed what his phrase was worth. When the common adversary vanished, the concealed reality, which they preferred not to articulate aloud, was simple. The commitments of partners are worth something as long as they are accompanied by footsteps, hooves, and supply trains. After the collapse of Antioch, the encampment anticipated weeks for assistance from the north. There was discussion of forces about to descend from Asia Minor, of different vessels sailing along the coast, of rich supply trains that would restore assurance and provisions. Strategies were made based on these expectations, expanding the defenders, strengthening the fortifications, preparing for the subsequent phase of the expedition. Everyone relied on the alliance that had previously been sealed with a vow before Constantinople. But week after week passed, and the boundary remained vacant. When it became clear that no one was arriving and the imperial standards wouldn't materialize, conviction in the common project commenced to fracture. Optimism yielded to irritation, and irritation yielded to mutual recriminations. The ancient phrases resounded in the shelters again: vows, obligations, entitlements to the fortress, and everyone interpreted them in their own favor. Bohemond stated that Byzantium had abandoned them, which signified that the fortress should remain with those who had captured it. Raymond insisted on the debt owed to the alliance and the necessity to maintain at least the appearance of solidarity. Robert and Godfrey pursued a middle ground, but exhaustion and mistrust suspended in the atmosphere heavier than the combustion from the blazes. The military force, exhausted by the blockade, mastered to exist without support. Provision trains arrived rarely. Loaf was substituted by dried herbs and meager provisions. But most significantly, the sensation that someone was behind them vanished. For the initial time, the expedition became truly independent. This instant was the climax, the quietness after the thunder. The sensation of deception destroyed some of the trust, but didn't fracture the resolve of those who captured the fortress. On the contrary, it was here that the determination to advance to the conclusion was born, even without partners, without guarantees, and without backup. From this location, the forces converted south. Behind them existed vacancy. Ahead existed the route to Jerusalem. In this simplicity existed a different significance: to advance not for the sake of commitments, but for the sake of the expedition itself. Information that is worth millions today was then expressed in a handful of simple, almost prosaic realities: the structure of ration distribution, accurate accounting of individuals, sentinel timetables, and respect for agreements. After Antioch, it was these very things that preserved the expedition from disintegration. Where previously everything had been resolved by aristocratic impulse, now arrangement became the main weapon. The tactics of raids, strict regimentation on the advance, and the separation of forces into columns ceased to be a provisional measure. They became a system. Each unit understood its route, assembly duration, and share of provisions. Leaders were responsible not only for the blade, but also for structure in the baggage train. Disputes were postponed until the conclusion of operations, because now they understood that disagreements terminate faster than projectiles. The alliance with the maritime republics, the Venetians, Genoese, and Pisans, was not a political motion, but a matter of survival. Their vessels brought wheat, wine, liquid, and timber for assault equipment. Without these provisions, the southern plateaus would have become a fatal snare. Logistics became strategy, and trust in partners became protection more powerful than a defense. Progressively, the military force recognized that fortifications are not captured by demolition devices, but by duration, patience, and the precise rhythm of labor. Every day of anticipating, every raid, every transport load of timber became part of the great arithmetic of survival. The experience of Antioch made the warriors more attentive to details, to water, to loaf rations, to partners existing nearby. The capacity to listen to the natives, to negotiate, to account for the climate and routes preserved existences more often than the sharpness of blades. The blockade, which nearly concluded in starvation and discord, became a school of resilience. There they mastered not only to combat, but also to anticipate, to conserve energy, preserve respiration, and safeguard optimism as the most scarce resource. Therefore, Antioch became a training ground for maturity, a location where a coalition of adventurers became a military force capable of advancing further to Jerusalem, no longer out of conviction in a miracle, but out of a rigid understanding of how to maintain structure in the midst of the wilderness. What do you think of the theme of Antioch, where triumph was born of regimentation rather than abundance? Express in the comments what you think is the main lesson of this blockade: the concealed entrance, the representation that was discovered, or the capacity to convert a raid into structure. Write about which great engagements of the past you would like to witness in future episodes. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our different analysis.